Afternoon. First, I just want to say thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present the work we've done as a team. We are a team from 3 people. So the data collected in Sudan in 2008. So we try to go through it and explain where we are. So the outline of there, we will talk about the introductions, the conflict in Nuba Mountains, and we talk about the data, what type of data we collected, the empirical strategy, and the main result, and the conclusion. This is the outline of our study. So the introduction, when we took to the Nuba Mountain, we talk about the literature background, which found that is by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that they have more than 40 million of people who were displaced, internally displaced, or refugees who were forced displacement because of the war conflict. So these people, they are facing so many problems, and to cope with the social and economic consequences of this displacement when they move back after end of the civil war. When they move back to their areas, they are facing by so many problems to recover from the war. So the most important thing, this literature background is give us some information which is fit to so much to our finding of the research. So we have previous studies have shown that severe consequences of the displacement, people they are affected by the displacement, they lose their assets. Because when they come back to their areas, they found that their assets were destroyed, they don't have any more way to invest, and they have to start from scratch. The second thing, they have nutritional problems because they don't have any capacity to plant, or they don't have the seeds, and they don't have the means to survive. That's after they return back to their area. Then the third finding, we find that is loss of productive skills. So this is the finding which we get it from the literature background. This is some of the negative or disadvantage of being displaced or internally displaced. But not everything is negative. We find there are also some positive for those refugees and internally displacement in terms of they are more or less highly motivated in productivity, specifically in area like Burundi. When they come back, they have new ideas on how to cultivate the area, which type of food they can, because they learn from the host community where they stayed, or because of the support given to them from the international organization. Then the other thing, they have better attitude in terms of the better health outcomes. This is also found in the literature. So people, they are more exposed to new type of hygienes. They wash their hands, they take care of their health more than the people stayed in the area. So the internally displaced, they learn new way how to cope with the situation. So the other thing is the introduction. We try to talk about Nuba Mountain. Nuba Mountain, this is area located in western part of Sudan. It was western part of Sudan, but now after the separation of South Sudan, so it is the southern part of the current Sudan. So the populations there are different. It's called also Nuba Hills. They consist of about more than 50 ethnic groups. They have difference in religious, and so. But they are, originally they came from the north, and they have been displaced and forced to move and stay in this Nuba Mountain during the 17th century. And this group of people, they exposed to slavery raids since the 17th century when the Arabs started to enter Sudan, and because of the Arabizations and Islamizations. So there is, we try to study describe the characters or the economic characteristics of the households, of the main households between the state population and the returnee population in the Nuba Mountain. We talk about people who are staying in the area which controlled by the National Congress Party, which is the government of Northern Sudan, or the current government of Sudan, and then the people who stayed in the area controlled by Sudan People's Liberation Movement. This is a movement, the rebel movement, which is controls the area of southern Kordofan. They are part from the south, but then later on they are joined Nuba Mountain or Nuba people, they join this movement. So we find fundamental differences with regard our findings of the data. We find there are about 4 factors which we find in ours. They have less returnees who came from the house. They have less assets, and they have also less livestock, and they are likely to cultivate only stable foods. They don't capable to cultivate cash crops like the stayers. And also they are better off in terms of attitude, health attitude, and better access to the hygiene. Then we find that there is no differences between the former rebel area and the government villages. So between the 2 groups, we didn't find so many differences. This is only the 3 characteristics we find it. So given as we see that is the data, or we try to go into discussion of the data, it's a little bit limited because we don't have any idea about the area, how these people were before the conflict, where do they stay, and so we cannot find any causal for the way. So our information is more descriptive, and we hope that for the time being, there is a war. There is a very severe war in this area, started since 2011, and until now it's continuous. So if there is any peace, we hope that when we go back, we can use this data to confirm our findings. So with the things which happened before the war, and now, if there is any peace, we accept that it might be peace in the next 2 years in this area. So now we talk about the conflict. The conflict in Nuba Mountain, in different area. It started from the colonial regime, the British and Egyptian condemns, and then it continued up to 1970s, and then the last one, which covered our studies between 1983 to 2005. We don't talk about the conflict now. So this conflict ended up by the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement between South Sudan and North Sudan. So the Nuba Mountains, they exposed, as I said, to a lot of slavery raid and problems. This is what unified them together with South Sudan People Liberation Movement. So they continue to move together until the area was isolated, like South Sudan, Blue Nile. It was isolated because the colonial assumes that these 3 areas are different in terms of culture from Northern Sudan. And also they try to protect them from the slavery raids. So this is how this area were being closed until 1956. And then it started the exploitations. So we don't talk about it a lot, but we talk about after the CPA in 2006, the people affected by the war started to return. So the population in Nuba Mountains, there are about 3.7 million, according to 2009 population censuses. So most of them, they took refugees either inside South Sudan, or they were in the mountains. They went up to the hills for the time of the war, for the last 20 years. Then after the CPA, they came back and they tried to build their nation. So they face by so many problems, and we try to see what kind of difficulties they face. So we use this data analysis. We analyze this data, and this map will show us where is the conflict and how the data started. It's about 500. We interviewed about 500 households. And most of the data was a little bit have a problem, but in total we have 305 total of the population interviewed in 8 villages in 3 areas. This is with the red spot. This is the area where we interview the people. So we concentrated in area which formally controlled by the government, 3 villages, and then 5 villages in area controlled by the SPLM. As I said, this is Sudan People Liberation Movement. And then we try to study the social and economic impact. So the final sample, as we said, is 350. So we compare the social and economic characteristic between the stayers and the returnees. So we have the information, or the data was very rich. We have all these characteristics. This is 8 characteristics. So we'll go first. So the empirical strategy And the result, this is the most important, that is the first, we explore the interview. Okay, particles. So I try to go quickly on it. So we talk about the returnees. This is a formula which we use. We compare the villages, the returnees in an area which is controlled by the government of South Sudan, the SPLA. So we compare, we have 3 areas, which is very important. That is, we give us a very rich information, extended families, and land size, and right to sell. The returnees, they came back because they have extended families. The land size is different. They have very small land size, and they have right to sell their land, unlike the people from the stayers. And then we use the characteristics. We compare also the characteristics of the stayers, and we find out that there is a difference in terms of income generating, in terms of access to the land. So we have different dependence variable, which is agricultural production, livestock, health, hygiene, and external. We find there is differences between returnees and stayers. So in terms of the agricultural productions, the returnees, they normally cultivate stable food, while the stayers, they cultivate cash crops. Livestock ownership is very little with regard to the returnees. They practically don't have. Health and hygiene, returnees, they are well informed about the hygiene, attitudes, how to deal with the waste and the things. And then external supports and attitudes, we find the returnees, they have more external support from international NGOs, from local NGOs, and also they linked, they cooperate, they have their own committees. They are well organized. So the agricultural productions, as we can see, that is here in our findings, it shows the correlation, that is the sorghum, millet, and groundnuts, this is the staple food, and the rest, sesame, peanuts, and fruits, this is the cash crop. It's normally is more or less related to the stayers. So the stayers, they are well-being than the returnees. Maybe this is the reason why maybe they left, because they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the cash, and they cannot earn from this. The livestock is not so big difference between the two, but we find that is the stayers, they have more livestock, and this means their income generating is better off than the stayers. So what is the main, in terms of the health and hygiene, we find that is the returnees, they are more or less, they have less problems, they have more problem with malnutrition, because maybe they are exposed to training, they knew what makes the children maybe less healthier. And also with regard to the family disease or death from disease, hygiene and wash, we find the returnees are better off. While in the dysentery and skin disease and respiratory diseases, we find this problem with the stayers. So this will give us also some kind of exposure or attitude, changing attitudes when they are outside. So in terms of external support, the returnees, they have more support, and they have family planning, they use to the control. We have the 2 variables, which is one when you have children. So we find the returnees, they have family plans. They try to control the family size. And also they have 3 meals, and they can buy food more than the stayers. So this will give us the idea why they are having less problem in terms of malnutrition, because they are aware about that. So in conclusion, in summary, that we find that our data, that in the conflict area and post-conflict area, we have in Nuba Mountain, we have 40% of the returnees, studies the 40% of the returnees in the forced displacement area. And we find that there is differences between returnees and stayers. Returnees have less assets, and they are better off in terms of health. And we find some differences with regard to the villages. It's not very big difference, but only in these 3 areas. And we expect that this result will help to contribute in research in Nuba Mountain, if there is any peace. So we will get more casual questions or answer to some of our questions which we couldn't find it. And the area need more research. We need more research to shed light in the cause and mechanism behind the differences that we have described before. So this is for welcome.
First of all, I want to say that, I mean, in conflict research, typically people conduct micro-level research in post-conflict countries that are rather stable, relatively easy to access, so relatively peaceful post-war conflict countries. And this creates kind of a sample bias in the literature on conflict. So typically you go to those countries that are more easy to survey. So I think you went to an area that's very remote, difficult to access, a very challenging environment. So I think it's an applaudable aspect of the paper. So you present a good descriptive analysis, a narrative that contributes to reducing the sample bias within the conflict literature, I think, because there's really not a lot of research or quantitative research on this area. That being said, I think that the sample selection within your own study is very large, and I think you are aware of that, and you pointed out at several sections of the paper. So first of all, you don't have information on the characteristics of refugees prior to the refugee crisis. So there may be some self-selection into refugee status, and this self-selection may depend on the characteristics that you then compare afterwards between returnee and non-returnee households. And a second source of self-selection is into returning to the area. So people may have fled the area, and some may have decided to return, others may have decided not to return. And so I think this problem can be extremely severe, and it's a bit of a pity that you don't have data on the size of villages, so the population size of different villages, and that you cannot show whether there is a huge difference in population size of these villages in the course of the period of conflict, because then you could, to some sense, give an indication of how severe this possible bias would be of people, who fled but did not return to the village. And so one of the findings that attracted my attention was the finding that those who returned, so compared to the non-refugee households, they have more secure land rights. And so then related to the sample bias issue, you could say that maybe only those who had secure land rights returned and the others didn't bother to return. Or, both groups returned, those with secure land rights, those with no secure land rights, but those who did not have secure land rights on certain plots lost these plots, and now they are left with plots for which they have secure land rights. So it would be interesting if you could include a discussion on whether households have different plots and whether land rights may, vary across these plots. And so whether you can come up with some maybe qualitative evidence, some narratives on whether households actually lost land. And I know that the research context is very challenging, but if it would be possible, and you can comment on that, to collect some recall data on households who returned, whether they lost land or not, what determined their decision to return, also survey neighbors and check with neighbors whether there were many households, refugee households, who did not return, and try to get some, not exact data, but a bit of flavor on the characteristics of these households. So those were my comments. So if you want, you can respond and then take some more comments.
Yeah, with regard to the most important things which I understand, that the returnees, I think we try to be very careful because it's descriptive. And when we look to the core or the reason behind the war, we find the people, they left their area because or they became rebel, and the war started because the law of the land and ownership were changed. During the colonial times, it was belonged to the community. But after the regime of Nimeris, they took the land, and they took the land from the community. It was, the land is belonged to the people. Yeah. And then the government is give the land to the investors from outside the villages, to the mechanized farming, of course. And they said the land has to be given to the people who can plant it and use it. So they have access, of course, to the credit facilities. Those farmers or the smallholders, they have no access to the credit facilities. And for that reason, this was the war. So they were just laborers, and they have to desert the area and go to the mountains, living in the mountains. So the most arable land was used by mechanized farming. So the local population, they lost their ancestors' land, and they took refuge in the hills. So after sometimes, when they fused this war, they thought maybe when the war will finish, then the land will taken again back to or given to the community. But that was not the case, because the land questions on the land ownership and land tenure until now not yet changed. And this is the main reason why the war started again in June, July 2007, because the community were promised, according to the peace agreement, that should be a popular consultation. This popular consultation, the Nuba Mountain people, they decided either to stay in the current Sudan or they join South Sudan. So as a government of Northern Sudan, they have to make unity attractive. So the most important reason, they have to deal with the issue of the land questions. So this was not dealt with. So this is why, again, the war started in 2011, and the people, the reason why they came to get the land back, it is not materialized. So that issue is still open. And I think now there is maybe possibility to go back, as we said, to do another research, but that can only be having if there is a peace. And this peace will not start it again because the price, I think, is very high. The government, they don't want to lose another part. The current government of Sudan, they don't want to lose another part. So for that reason, these refugees and these questions will be difficult to be done again in the coming future. But we are thinking to do the same study in South Sudan, because now we have refugees. They are coming also from Khartoum. It's about 4 million of the refugees. They also left the current Sudan, and now they are living in the same condition. They have the same situation. They have difficulties to integrate in the society in South Sudan, and the government until now in South Sudan, they didn't prepare them very well. The land questions also is a big issue, and this is why I think this study is very relevant in any part of Sudan or in any part of Africa. It can be again implemented, because the cause, I think some of the cause are really can be realistic. Some of them are a little bit descriptive, but I think the assets, access to land, investments, and credit facilities, this is the most important things which keep people to come back to their land. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Okay, no problem, you can hear.
I have a question on that. So I find this really interesting, but wherever the paper is descriptive, I would find it a lot easier to just see differences in meanings. Instead of partial correlations, because we never managed to get there anyway. That's just a presentational thing. In terms of substantive comments, I mean, one of the things that could be quite useful is if you got microdata for other places in South Sudan, which is available. So, there's, I mean, we can talk about data sources, but just to see exactly how different are these communities from the general communities. So, I mean, at least one level of selection you can get some bounds of. And if use it as some kind of analysis of what's happened to returnees versus stayers over this 4-year period since they've been back. And the data to do that exists. So, which is quite
Okay.
You said here in your conclusions that we need more research into the causal mechanisms of what you've observed. But I'm just very interested in the decision to not cultivate cash crops over the returns. Is it due from what you've observed to something concrete in terms of agricultural inputs or land tenure, or is it more about a change in risk preferences? Is it this experience of going away and going back? And we haven't focused on that. Maybe we have some
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the most important reason for that, these refugees or returnees, when they came back to Sudan, they didn't have any money, so they rely mostly on the World Food Programs, so they give them seeds. And the seed is concentrated to be just stable food. So it's for them, they don't have any money to go to the market. In most cases, those stayers, they normally buy the seeds for cash crop from the market, or they save it from the last season, from the last year season. For those returnees, they just start from scratch. I remember when we went and visited them in the village, they store all this stable food in their houses and they distributed it. So they normally use whatever they get from the international community. And the international community normally, they only concentrate on food. They try to prevent children from being malnourished, and they try just to let them move with the food until they get some money maybe from their relatives. We normally ask them, where do they get the seeds? They said, the seeds, they get it from the international organization. How you don't buy, they said they don't have money to buy. And also if you want to plant fruits and vegetables, this will take you about 2 to 3 years. If you want to cultivate fruits, mango, guava, it takes 2 to 3 years. This is a long period of time. So to get them in the legs, then they need also a lot of work. So we had some project, a small project and training in some villages, 2 or 3 villages, they get access to training how they plant cash crops, and also they get a credit facility or what do you call it, revolving funds. So a group of women, they started to do that, and they work very well. Some of the villages, especially the most largest one, we call it in our study. So this is not far away from them. And also they build a dam, the Care International, they built for them a dam where they can harvest the water, and they can use it during the dry season. So that is how they started. So the recovery, it might take them maybe 5 years. This is why we said it will be good if there were stability, there were peace, then one can see the result after 4 or 5 years. When I went 2008, did that research, and again I went 2011 before the war. 1 month before the war started there. Then you can see the difference. People, they started to cultivate and use it. But then the war came and damaged most of the things. Okay. Oh. Okay, thank you. Welcome. How does this work? Marika, do you know how... Hier?
Nee, daar van boven. En deze is...
Okay, good afternoon. I currently work for the well-being program in the Center of Economic Performance in the London School of Economics. So my research usually focuses on mental health and well-being in the UK, but recently I've been able to collaborate on a very interesting data set from Rwanda that contains some measurement of mental health. So today I will show you some of our first findings, because this is very much work in progress, So any comments would be more than welcome. So we will talk about the link between mental health, conflict, and economic performance in post-genocide Rwanda. Why do we care about mental health? First of all, it has been shown that the cost of mental distress in OECD countries are quite large. Also, there appears to be a strong association between mental distress and economic outcomes such as labor productivity, labor market participation, and also educational attainment. It's difficult, however, to establish causality due to the link between income and mental health in both ways. However, some IV results that are rather credible have been found, and they do show that a drop in market labor participation due to a drop in mental health. A lot of people would argue that mental health is a rich world problem, but is that really the case? Most evidence shows that the levels of common mental health disorders are equal among developed and developing countries. However, as argued by Patel in 2000, only half of African countries currently have mental health policies. So currently the World Health Organization is working to actually reduce the gap in access to mental health services by integrating mental health into primary care policies in low-income countries. Patel argues that mental disorders might be the hidden obstacle to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. That's maybe a bit strong, but there are some advocates that say that this is a big issue. I think especially in post-conflict settings, we might have to look at mental health because there's very high prevalence levels of post-traumatic stress disorder in these post-conflict societies. A lot of studies show this. Also, most research in post-conflict recovery process actually looks at the effect of conflict on human capital and physical capital, but not a lot has been done on the effects of conflict actually on mental health and then the effect of mental health on economic recovery. There's some evidence from Longman and colleagues that there's a strong negative association between post-traumatic stress syndrome and positive attitudes toward reconciliation. This is evidence from Rwanda. This is another kind of, this is other evidence that it might be interesting to start looking at this more. Okay, as we all know, in Rwanda in 1994, there was a very violent conflict. In about 100 days, 10% of the population was killed. It was mostly male adults that were the targets, but women have experienced a lot of sexual violence and, of course, trauma caused to being witnesses of all this violence. Despite economic recovery to the levels of the 1990s and 2002, we do find that economic inequality increased. So there's some evidence that genocide widows are more likely to be chronically poor and suffer from ill health. Also, households that experienced murder or imprisonment of their members considerably moved down in the income distribution. This shows that there might be a link between mental health and current economic performance. That's why we were interested in looking at this question. Then from psychiatrist studies, we find that there is indeed very high levels of post-traumatic stress syndrome in current Rwandese society. So I think the most interesting study is the one, the first one that's done in 2008 because they have a very big sample that covers 5 provinces. Most other studies look at small socio-demographic groups. But this one actually estimates that 26% of the population suffers from post-traumatic stress syndrome. The associated factors in the study point towards extreme poverty, murder of close relatives, being a widow, losing both parents, having lost both parents, and so these are orphans, and then living in the South province, which so in the South there was more genocide-related violence, so that might indeed be true. In refugee camps, it's been estimated to be 50%. Prevalence of panic disorder amongst widows has been estimated to be 40%. So there's a lot of different estimates depending on which groups you look at. What will we do? Well, we will take a classic household production function where we control for human capital, physical capital, labor, land, some household characteristics, but we will introduce mental health as one of the components that might generate income in Rwanda. So we look at it as an input in the production function. We will also do so control for physical health because these two are very correlated. And in Rwanda, it's quite necessary to control for commune-level genocide-related violence intensity. These are findings of Mareke that even, how many years was it after the genocide? In 2005. So in 2005, they found that in terms of consumptions, there's still a difference in those communities that experienced more violence, so we control for this directly. Then for a mental health measure, we take the general health questionnaire. These are 12 questions. So have you recently been able to concentrate on whatever you're doing? And you can have a look, I'm not going to read them all. But what do these measures measure? Basically, they measure the inability to carry out normal daily functions and also the appearance of stress. The World Health Project on Mental Illness that has been looking at mental health in both developed and developing countries has used the scale, so it's cross-culturally validated. This is the kernel density of our mental health measure, so it's relatively normal distributed in our sample. Of course, what are the problems? I already tell you we didn't solve them, so have no expectations. Reverse causality, like I said, this link goes in two directions. Of course, unobserved individual heterogeneity will also be a problem. Measurement error, which might be also a problem. This is not the best measure maybe for post-traumatic stress, so this might also be a problem. We do have, that's the strength of this research, is we have a very unique data set. So there is data from before the genocide, then there's data from 2002 and data from 2008. So only in 2008 we have a measure for mental health. So what happened is that in 2002, some researchers went back to Rwanda and actually traced some households that were in the 1991 national sample. So these are, therefore we have also information on before the genocide. Commune level conflict measures, like I just said, we have a conflict measure on the commune level, and this comes from a population census and also the records of the transnational justice system for genocide suspects. So this is a map. Our households are in Gitamera and Gikongoro. So these two provinces had more kind of the genocide-related violence, less civil war-related violence. Okay, so what do we see? 40% of our sample are female or widows, because this seems to be, of course, quite the same thing in Rwanda currently. And then 22% of our sample are genocide survivors. On average, these people are 14 days a year ill, so numbers of days ill will be our measure of physical health or ill health. Anything else? No. So yeah, the age of the household head on average is 54. Maybe I didn't explain it, but so what we have is we have 210 after all the missing values. We have 210 households, and so we take mental health of the household head as a measure of overall mental health of the household. And so when I talk about age and survivor or female, these are the household heads, basically. So we first have a look at the determinants of mental health. What we can see is that indeed, this is a very general finding across countries. Higher age and being female is significantly, gives you significantly lower health on average. Ill health as well, is that right? Yeah, ill health, yeah, is also significantly associated with lower mental health. Schooling appears to be a protective factor. Then if we look at the second column, we included some of our measures of violence intensity, or some measures where we believed they might be related to mental health. So the first is the sum of household members that died violently during the conflict. So not natural deaths, these are excluded, these are only the violent deaths. We do find that on average they are household members who had several of their members killed have on average lower mental health. The same for being a refugee until 2002. So now we kind of look at the household production function. So first of all, the first column shows you the raw correlation between income and mental health. Then we control for all our production factors, and we see that this correlation still remains. Okay, maybe you might argue, well, you're looking at income, that's not a very good measure. Why don't you look at a more permanent measure? So we've tried this. So we look at the value of assets, and we see that the same correlation kind of exists there between mental health and the value of assets in 2008, controlling for all other factors. Then what I find most interesting about all of this is when we include an interaction term between mental health and being a widow, we find that mental health actually doesn't matter so much for income anymore, but the interaction term becomes quite significant. Another very interesting finding, maybe a bit controversial, is that survivors in 2008 have on average higher incomes. You might think widowhood is something quite particular, especially in Africa, so there's a lot of social capital issues that come with this. So we kind of put like dummies for several measures of social capital to see whether our interaction term remains. And I've tried a lot, these are some of them. Nothing really makes these estimates less robust. So you see the same thing. However, if you can get credit if needed, it seems to be very important for household income, but then you don't see any effect on the interaction term. I find that quite interesting. So here again, some other measures of social capital. Same thing. We tried to do an IV estimation, and you would say if you look at our two instruments, maybe it might have worked. I'm not so sure because everything I tried, I was not able to get F-stats in the first stage above 6. So all my combinations of instruments are actually weak, which is, therefore, it's very difficult to actually say something about causality. So this is the first stage. This is the best kind of IV strategy that I encountered. And we use instruments, the sum of young adults who died violently, and also commune level distance to Nyanza, because Nyanza was the former Tutsi capital before colonial period, but the economic importance of Nyanza has completely declined during colonial period and is non-existent now. So it's only that there were more Tutsis there before the genocide, so therefore it might bring some exogenous variation in the level of mental health. So this is my IV estimates. It's a bit disappointing because, as you see, my standard error goes up, my coefficient barely changes, so I don't really know what this means. Maybe it is the fact that the instruments are not strong enough, maybe the sample is simply too small to do an IV strategy. However, what would I conclude? I think for me, what I find most interesting is there appears to be a very strong association between mental health and income generating capacity of around these households, and this association seems to be particularly strong for households that are headed by widows. The lack of a sufficiently strong instrument makes this causal claim difficult. Maybe we need to look at more, also maybe we need to have a more specific psychological assessment instrument for post-traumatic stress syndrome, because this is not really the same thing what we're measuring. We're measuring depression and not really post-traumatic stress syndrome, so that might be another issue. Another finding that we have, I mean, we were not looking for this, but it came across in the analysis, is that despite higher income, no, that's a typo. Despite lower levels of mental health, Rwandese genocide survivors have on average higher incomes in 2008, which is on its own, I think, quite an interesting finding. I think overall in this literature it might be interesting to start kind of introducing some measures of psychological distress, because after all, I guess policymaking should try to increase well-being of the people. So maybe it's also in itself quite an interesting outcome measure also in development economics. So that's it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
My comments is very similar to what you have done. So for me, I find the paper is very interesting. As she said, this is the post-traumatic because of the war. It's a really serious problem in all this area. I can see that. I just take the case of South Sudan. In South Sudan, we have so many people running, wandering in the street. You can see them; they are crazy, running naked, and they lay in the main road, and they are. Some of them also they try to commit suicide. So this is why when you look into these sicknesses, it's not really related to the rich country. It's rather related to. It can happen in any society, and it needs really further research. And I find this research is a good step, but as you said, it has so many. It lacks proper instruments, and I think we have to rely on psychological assessment more. Maybe it will be very interesting, because this is because I'm not a psychologist, and the other things I have just one or two questions with regard to those people who survive, the survivors, the genocide survivors, have on average a lower value of assets, but as shown from the previous result, on average, they have higher current income. How this comes? This is my question. Why this is happening?
Yeah, it was in the previous
Yeah?
slides that I sent you. I left it out because we're still looking at this, but it's true that
Okay.
some of us also
Mm. Okay. Oh. Mm. Okay. This need also, yeah, you need to explore in this a lot. And also there is a lot of high prevalence of mental disorders, 40 to 50%. This is very alarming. It's confirmed in your studies. And what I think, the richer, the more richer the people, I think, the more they are affected by this traumatized, I think. When you find the lower income people or these women, the widows, they don't have a lot of money, they don't lose a lot. So I don't think this problem is affecting the lower income group. This is from your finding a lot, I don't know. This, I think so. Because you lose everything when you are rich, and then you come out from the war, you don't have house, you don't have car, you don't have anything. So anyway, we have some of the colleagues, for example, coming from as diaspora, they join the universities now, and suddenly they find they don't have salaries, they don't have house, or the type of life they have in Sudan or in asylum has changed and went down. So they have now mental problem. These all things can be considered. So if people they have higher income, maybe they are more affected. I think this is my comment.
I'm not sure if you can actually answer this question with this data, but I'm interested to see what the statistics say. Because I
Yes.
So I don't know if you can, of course it's already a tricky distinction, but maybe in this data you can explore a little bit, at least by ethnic group, have an idea of who was a perpetrator, who was victim, because then you're going to have two different kind of mental distress that will affect. So that would be something worth it to explore. But a little bit related to what was Asha was saying, since you have this nice panel data that we don't have at all for our data, one thing that you can really explore is like if people that in 2008 has some mental problems, how is this related to the change in household income, let's say, of before and after the war? This you can do it with your plan strategy. So you can see what was the change in assets, in household income, or whatever, before and after the genocide, and how this affected. So then you can have a little bit, you can strongly claim causality, but at least you have you're going to have a good point there, because you can see these changes. This is something that definitely should explore.
Yeah. I think in a way it's maybe even more interesting to stop trying to establish this causality and look at the link between income mobility and mental health. And why not just take mental health as an outcome? It's something we might care. I mean, it's like I said, we try to always look at economic outcomes, but maybe it's also interesting in these kind of settings to look at who are the people who are actually doing, who feel well in this society. Because maybe it is true that what we find is, for example, survivors have higher income, but they're not feeling maybe that well because they do have some traumas. So maybe looking at mental health as a dependent variable, looking then at like the fact, like indeed, like exploring the panel and looking at income movements and this relation, I think that might be some. Yes, because it's so much like very like from the start. So we're like kind of looking at a lot of directions. Is there some other? Yes.
You mentioned your instrument was not very specific to post-traumatic stress. I think it seems a bit like it's more misery almost, so you find when people are less happy.
Yeah.
It seems like, but how would you, what would you include to make it more specific to post-traumatic stress?
Well, there's way better, like we don't have this data, but I mean for people who want to do research on this, what you should look at is, I can give you the names, but there's a lot of clinical assessment instruments that look specifically at post-traumatic stress in post-conflict settings, which is of course a better measure of this than like a general health question, like a question measurement. Because it's true, I think you would, like this would completely maybe give different results. I'm not sure completely, but it would like improve at least, yeah. Something else? Okay.
So we stick with the case of Rwanda. So in Neil, her dataset, you saw that like the proportion of widow-headed, female-headed households in your data was like over 30%. So I'm discussing a related issue. So I'm talking about armed conflict, sex ratio, and marital outcomes in Rwanda. Typically what you see in post-conflict countries is a fairly low sex ratio, so a relative scarcity of men. And you may think that this can have a welfare impact, and more specifically through the channel of the marriage market. Now, in modern societies where women are independent, emancipated, an increased competition for husbands may not have, very severe consequences. If anything, it may increase the number of happy single women in the population. So you may encounter more women shopping on Saturday, spending more money on things they like. So no big deal, but in traditional societies where kinship and childbearing are very important, an imbalance in the sex ratio may have actually very severe consequences, in theory, at least. So, for instance, in Rwanda, there is a saying, a woman does not have an identity, she takes her husband's. This illustrates well how much a woman depends on her husband or, you know, any kind of male relative in her family, her father, her brother, brothers-in-law. Another saying, or the most grave insult in Rwanda, means may you die childless. At the same time, extramarital pregnancy is an abomination, so you better be married and have children at the same time. And there are also economic effects. For instance, a woman's access to land is entirely dependent on her relationship with men, mostly through marriage. But for instance, if her husband dies, she becomes a widow, and then she's dependent on, for instance, her brother-in-law for access to land. So that's why we are interested in how conflict-induced decreases in the sex ratio may affect marital outcomes in traditional African societies. And in this paper, we take the case of Rwanda. And so during the violent period of the 90s, the sex ratio decreased quite dramatically. It stood at 0.94 in 1991, and it decreased to 0.77 in 2002. So this means that in 2002, there were 77 men for each 100 women in the population aged 20 to 60 years. Okay, so this is quite a drastic decrease. And so we wonder how this affects marital outcomes in Rwanda. And so raising this question, we are in good company. Gary Becker received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on marriage, market, and family formation. And so one of my favorite quotes comes from the book 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And the quote says that 95% of economic models can be explained in very simple words. And so I think that, and this is not to discredit Becker's work, but I think that the predictions of his work can be illustrated in a few very silly pictures. So if you stare for a couple of seconds at these pictures, you will get his point. So what happens when the sex ratio decreases? So basically, if men become scarce, their price increases. This is one prediction, and so this is mostly materialized or more clearly materialized in a decrease in dowry relative to bride price. Polygamy may be on the rise, extramarital relationships may be on the rise. Men may feel less obliged to make legally binding commitments. Women may settle for less, so they may choose otherwise less attractive husbands, so less wealthy, less educated, older. Also, children born out of wedlock may increase, and also within the household, Becker would predict that women lose bargaining power, so they would, work harder and spend less money on their favorite consumption goods, maybe. Okay, these are some of the predictions. Of course, when you make bold predictions like that, researchers jump on it and try to test these predictions. So there have been quite some studies looking at the impact of sex ratios on marital outcomes and on the bargaining power of women inside households. And so one complication for these empirical studies is that the sex ratio in itself is endogenous. So a change in the sex ratio may be related to several factors that in itself also directly affect marital outcomes, such as, most typically labor market situations. And so to get around that problem, researchers have looked for quasi-experiments. So they have looked for events that created exogenous variation in the change in sex ratios. And here are a couple of examples. So changes in immigration law or the demographic transition, the one-child policy, but also researchers have looked at armed conflict as a quasi-experiment that creates some kind of exogenous variation in the sex ratio. And so there exist studies for the World Wars 1 and 2, looking at the impact of war-induced changes in the sex ratio in France, Germany, Russia. There are also a couple of studies looking at the effect of changing sex ratios after war in Asia. But so far there is no study looking at these marital outcomes after war in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is, I think, a blind spot because, first of all, there have been many civil wars in Africa. And secondly, most African societies are still very much traditional. So a change in the sex ratio may have a large effect. So this motivates our research. I don't have data on all of these predictions of Gary Becker's. So in this paper, we will just look at marital status. So whether women and men remain single, engage in consensual unions, so informal unions, or engage in a more formalized marriage. And I also look at the changes in children born outside legal unions. So for this purpose, we combine a large individual level data set from before and after the genocide. I will talk a bit more about that later. And we instrument for the change in the sex ratio using conflict intensity proxies. So in our first econometric specification, we run a simple OLS model in which we look at the effect of the sex ratio at time t in commune C, and we have information from 145 different administrative communes. So the sex ratio varies across 145 different units, so across space, but also across time. We look at marital outcomes there for individual I in year T in commune C, and we include a whole range of controls, most importantly wealth, house ownership, and being a migrant. It's very important to include these controls because they may also have been affected by conflict and at the same time affect marital outcomes. So conflict may not only have an impact on marital outcomes through the change in the sex ratio, but also through change in poverty, migration status, and so on. So that's why we control for all of these things. In addition, we include commune fixed effects. So this means that alpha 2, or a coefficient of interest, actually captures how the change in marital outcomes varies with the change in the sex ratio in a given commune. Okay? So we control for all kinds of commune level characteristics that remain invariant over time by putting in these commune fixed effects. Okay? So this figure gives you a picture of the spatial pattern of the change in sex ratios. There where you find dark red color, or the communes where the sex ratio decreased most. These are kernel densities of the sex ratio in 1991 and in 2002. So you see a drastic shift to the left and still quite some variation in sex ratios across the communes. So of course, this variation in sex ratio, as I already said, it can be endogenous. So it can be related to other factors, commune level characteristics, that in their turn also can affect marital outcomes. So that's why in a second specification, we instrument for the sex ratio. Okay? And we do so by including in the first stage 2 genocide intensity proxies. The first one is the share of Tutsi in the 1991 population, so before the genocide. And the second one is the share of genocide suspects in the post-genocide population. And these 2 instruments are defined at a commune level. And so if the exclusion restriction holds, then by instrumenting for the sex ratio, alpha 2 should now capture the effect of an exogenous change in the sex ratio in a given commune on marital outcomes. So let me talk a bit about these instruments. So in these 2 figures, you find the change in the sex ratio on the vertical axis. Okay? And on the left panel, you see the first instrument, the share of Tutsi in a commune on the horizontal axis. And in the second right panel, you find the share of genocide suspects per commune. And you see that both instruments are strongly correlated to the change in the sex ratio, meaning the more Tutsi in the pre-genocide population, the stronger the drop in the sex ratio, the more genocide suspects after the genocide, the stronger the drop in the sex ratio. So why is this? This is intuitive, this is what we expected, but let me make the reasons explicit. So first of all, the genocide targeted Tutsi, and especially Tutsi men. On average, more Tutsi men were killed than Tutsi women. Now, in areas where Tutsi women were left to survive, they actually served as witnesses in the transitional justice system, and this resulted in the naming of genocide suspects. So where Tutsi women were left to survive, you will find more genocide suspects in the commune, because there were more people to point them out. So this is one reason why the genocide suspects are correlated with a drop in the sex ratio, reflecting that Tutsi women were left to survive in those communes, whereas in other communes they were killed at the same time as their husbands. Also, the more genocide suspects, the more prisoners. And in some of the sex ratios we calculate, we actually exclude prisoners from the population because they are in prison and not actually on the marriage market. Okay? So we run regressions both including and excluding prisoners. But so when we exclude prisoners, of course, the proportion of genocide suspects is more strongly related to the drop in the sex ratio. And so to measure our marital outcomes, we take data from 2 waves of the Rwandan population census. So one in 1991 and the other one in 2002. And we take a 10% random draw from these census data. So we end up with about 700,000, 800,000 observations for each time period. And as left-hand side variables, we calculate indicator variables for being single, living in consensual union, so as opposed to being formally married. We define for children whether they are born inside a legal union or outside a legal union. And we do that both for children of all ages and children who were born in the 12 months prior to the census. We do that to exclude, for instance, children who were born as a result of rape, and so were then often born outside legal unions. So that's why we also look at newborns, so children born in the past 12 months prior to the census. We do not include all individuals in our calculations. We look at age groups who were on the marriage market. Okay? So we restrict the age groups for women and men to those individuals who were likely to be on the marriage market, either at the time of the census, either between the end of the genocide and the census. So before I show you the regression results, let me talk you through a couple of descriptive figures. So here you see, in the top panel, you see the share of single women in the population across ages. The solid line gives you the share in 1991. The dotted line gives you the share in 2002. So you see that the share of single women has increased a bit over time, especially when you look at middle-aged women, so slightly older women. For single men, you find the opposite. The share of single men has decreased in the population, and this is true for almost all age groups. So here we look at women and men living in consensual union as opposed to formal unions. So formal meaning, married either in customary law, either in statutory law. Okay. So you see that both for women and men, the share of consensual unions is on the rise in 2002 compared to 1991. And also for children born outside legal unions, we see an increase. Okay. So now, I compared this with data from Tanzania. And for Tanzania also what we see, for instance, is an increase in single women. Right? So this can be just some kind of modernization trend. Also, for consensual union, I couldn't compare it because Tanzania didn't have these separate categories for informal unions and formal unions. But also here one could say like this is just a modernization, trend, and so consensual unions are on the rise almost everywhere in the world. But for single men, this is quite exceptional. So the decline of single men in the population, this is not at all, a result that can be found in other countries. But in any case, what we want to do to make sure that we, find out whether these patterns are linked to a change in the sex ratio is turn to the regression analysis, where we, as explained before, look at the variation in the sex ratio over time and across 145 communes, and link it then to the outcomes of interest, so never married, consensual union, and out of wedlock births, for women, for men, and here for children and for newborns. And so as you see, we control for wealth quintiles, house ownership, migrant status, umudugudu, post-war, Tutsi, schooling, Muslim, Protestant, urban trend, share rich and share migrant in the population. And we include age fixed effects and commune fixed effects. So let me zoom into the results, so the coefficient of interest on the sex ratio. Here you see a negative coefficient, meaning that the lower the sex ratio, the higher the share of women never being married. For men, you see the opposite results. The lower the sex ratio, the lower the share of men never being married. Okay. Here for consensual union, you see both for women and men a negative coefficient, meaning the lower the sex ratio, the higher the share of consensual unions. And you see that for women the coefficient is somewhat larger. This could point to the existence of informal polygamy. Polygamy is actually legally not allowed in Rwanda, and so it would not be reported, and even in some of the census data it was not considered as a separate category. So if you would live in polygamy, you may just report that you're living in consensual union. And so also for out-of-wedlock births, you see for both for children and for newborns, the lower the sex ratio, the higher the share of children born outside legal unions. And so when we compare this with the IV results, we see qualitatively similar results. But the coefficients for the IV are larger, in some cases much larger. I'm still looking into explanations for this, but one conjecture could be that in places where men migrate to, for instance, for employment reasons, the sex ratio is relatively high and traditional values may be relatively low. Okay, so this is one explanation for the difference between the magnitude of the OLS and the IV coefficients. So to conclude, the main findings are that a sharp drop in the sex ratios in Rwanda is found to be associated with a higher proportion of unmarried women, a lower proportion of single men, an increase in consensual unions, and more children born outside legal unions. Okay, so what? Is this, alarming? Why should we care? One of the problems is that when you look at inheritance law in Rwanda or land law, both customary and statutory, in both circumstances, women who are not legally married have no inheritance rights, and their children neither. So if there is a large share of women and children who are deprived of inheritance rights, especially to land, this may potentially create social unrest. And needless to say that young men in Rwanda have a history of engagement in violence, and also there have been studies showing that a failure to access land in Rwanda has intensified the genocide. So I think there is some reason to worry about these findings. On the other hand, I wouldn't be too pessimistic. I think also the women in Rwanda have used their, the situation of outnumbering men in a positive and in a constructive way. So one piece of evidence is that Rwanda, ranks 1 in the list of countries with, for their share of women in parliament, which reaches almost 50%. And also, when it comes to, implementing laws, I think that women have their say in Rwanda. I just came back from Rwanda, and what was striking to me was that one of the tasks of the police force was to trace husbands and fathers who abandoned their children and make them, force them to legally recognize their children and make them pay alimentation. So, I mean, on the one hand, you could say, this doesn't look very, good, and maybe women will suffer. And so maybe this is just in the short run that you have these, additional mental, social, economic costs. But I think in the longer run, there is some dynamism and some mechanisms for adaptation. And so I wouldn't be too pessimistic about these findings. Okay, so thank you for your attention. I will let my discussant off the hook because she commented on an earlier version of this paper, but I welcome comments from the floor. Yes?
I think that differences in bargaining. So maybe not like using bargaining games, but maybe using relative status of the parents at time of marriage, or maybe women taking less than husbands.
Yeah, so bargaining power, okay. Yeah. More questions? Yes?
There's not enough evidence about social status, whether due to the change in sex ratio or that to marrying more men and more status.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Maybe I start with these 3 questions and then I can collect some more if there are more. So first, bargaining power. Of course, we don't observe that. And maybe the closest thing that we're looking at is consensual unions. So the fact that consensual unions are on the rise signals something about bargaining power of women relative to men, because consensual unions are more or less convenient for men because they do not, give them the same responsibilities as would they choose for formal marriage, either customary or statutory. But for women, it doesn't have any advantage whatsoever. So in this sense,
They still have no land access or...
No, they don't have land access at all in consensual unions. So, I think that's the closest we come to observing, some shift in bargaining power. The census data are very nice because you have many observations, but the disadvantage is that you don't have detailed information on household assets, expenditures, because otherwise you could look at, what Becker predicts, that the household budget will be allocated in a way that favors, male consumption goods, but we cannot look into these detailed questions, so unfortunately. Then the question of Jean-François with respect to assortative matching, right? We look at assortative matching, like age difference and education difference, right? What we find is that age difference decreases in 2002, but for young girls. So young girls, instead of marrying like middle-aged men, they marry now younger men. And for older women, we find actually an increase in the age difference. But I didn't show these results because the exclusion restriction does not hold. So the Sagan test rejects the validity of the instruments. And so this means that, you know, there is something going on, but it's not through the channel of the sex ratio, it may be through another channel. So we're still investigating that. Also for education difference, we try to do some analysis, but here we have the same problem. So that's why I didn't show the results, but we are working on that because we do have data on that. And then about policy and law changes, actually the law changed and the policy is changing. So this inheritance law, before women could not even inherit from their fathers. They could even not inherit even if they were legally married. They would only inherit if they had a son and not a daughter. So inheritance, you know, was only reserved for males. And so there were law changes in 2005 that also accorded inheritance rights to females, so to daughters and wives, but only within the context of legal marriage. And so, yeah, there was a law change, and many people think that it was already some progress, but probably not enough to also protect these women living in consensual unions. But now you have this police force, you know, tracking all these husbands living in consensual unions and not, you know, respecting their responsibilities, and they're, you know, pushed into paying alimentation, recognizing their children. And so also Rwanda has organized these massive civil marriages. So a ceremony with like 100, 200, 300 couples, like marrying properly, also to promote like legal marriage. So there is something moving, and that's also why I'm not too pessimistic about these results. Yeah. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I think, you know, I keep on saying that I'm not too pessimistic, but that's because I look, you know, far into the future. But I acknowledge that at this point in Rwanda, there is certainly a problem with bargaining power of women, young women, who do not find, you know, a proper husband who has, you know, built a house and has access to land, etc. And I think it can, you know, in the short run, increase problems of HIV. And yeah, I just come back from Rwanda. I must say that I feel that, you know, this whole issue is approached in a way that, you know, is not very careful. And so there's also this recent book of Summers. It's called Stuck. And he describes really that young girls come to Kigali because they cannot find husbands in rural areas. And so they end up in prostitution, I mean, or some kind of you know, sexual services. Yeah, and often unprotected. More questions? No? Okay, thank you for your participation and comments.